Welcome to Cold War Conversations.
This is the British Broadcasting Corporation.
Fünf, zwei, sieben, eins, sechs, sechs, neun, acht, drei.
Well, who's our first letter from today, Edward?
An old friend of yours, Doris, Brian Hartley of Thornton-le-Field, asking what's being done to build up Anglo-Soviet relations.
And I'm here to host this final program from the German Democratic Republic for you.
Welcome to episode 8 of Cold War Conversations. Before we start, a few requests. I'd like to ask you to place reviews wherever you listen to the show from. Positive iTunes reviews really help me to raise the profile of the podcast. Also, if you haven't already, there's a vibrant discussion group growing on Facebook. Just search for Cold War Conversations. So, enough publicity. Let's get on to the subject of today's podcast. Russell Phillips has written several books on Warsaw Pact military equipment, and our conversation is an interesting exchange covering the evolution in design, tactics, and the deployment of Warsaw Pact armed forces should the Cold War have turned hot. It covers slightly off-topic conversation about saunas and swimming pools in Soviet submarines, and Frankie Goes to Hollywood too. We welcome Russell Phillips. Hello, Russell.
Hello, Ian.
How are you this evening?
I'm good, thanks.
Can you, first of all, just give us a little bit of background about you?
Certainly. I was born in 1970, so I grew up during the Cold War. Didn't really pay that much attention for most of it at the time, which I kind of, looking back on it now, it kind of seems like a missed opportunity. But I guess when I was like 12 and 13, I had no idea that I'd be interested in this 30 years down the line. This all started because I'm a war gamer. I was a World War II gamer. You know, that was the bit of military history that really caught my attention. Mm-hmm. In the late 1980s, the war games club I was in started playing. At the time, we called them ultra-modern war games because it was...
yeah. It was present day virtually, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. You know, I had a bit of a hiatus from wargaming, and when I came back to it, it suddenly occurred to me that it's not ultra-modern anymore. It's like 30 years ago. Yeah,
it's almost ancient. Well, my kids call it ancient history.
So that's when I started getting interested in Warsaw Pact AFVs particularly. Mm-hmm. And there was, because I was always on the Soviet Warsaw Pact sort of side, so that's where most of my interest was. I had some interest and some knowledge of the Western equipment and things, but my main focus was always on the East.
Yeah, surely that was an unfair advantage. So can we start by you just explaining what the Warsaw Pact was? Because some of our listeners might not know what the Warsaw Pact was and which countries were members.
Okay, well, it was. It's just that I've got a copy of the treaty on my computer.
Oh, well, perfect. I'm expecting it verbatim then. That'll be a great podcast.
Technically, it's the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation and Mutual Assistance between the Soviet Union and certain East European communist governments. Signed at Warsaw, May the 14th, 1955. That's a catchy title for you.
Oh, yeah.
You can see why people called it the Warsaw Pact.
Yeah, I can see why people went for shorthand with that one.
But it's according to the introduction, it came about as a result of NATO being formed a few years prior. Mm-hmm. West Germany is starting to be remilitarized, and according to the treaty, it's all about the Eastern Bloc being the peace-loving people that they are, wanting to make sure that they maintained peace and that they had a defensive structure in case the West ever invaded.
Right.
Now, the initial parties were Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, the DDR, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and the Soviet Union.
Right. Okay. The usual suspects then.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. There's nobody missing out of that, is there, really? That would be obvious. So it's European-based
Yes.
alliance.
Yes, very much. Yugoslavia is not in there, but they always seem to be presented in the media and things as being on the part of the Eastern sort of bloc and part of the Soviet sphere of influence. But it always seemed to be quite a distant sort of relationship.
Yeah, well, I think they were part of the non-aligned movement, weren't they? So
yeah, I think so.
They sort of grouped with India and other countries like that didn't have any direct military alliances.
I do sometimes wonder how they managed it, being like surrounded by Warsaw Pact nations. I think their western border was with Italy and Austria or something like that. But yeah, they had a long border with the Warsaw Pact. I do sometimes wonder how they managed to keep that sort of stance.
But I guess any country would have been wary of invading Yugoslavia after their sort of guerrilla expertise in World War II.
That's true. I don't suppose it would have been a straightforward operation by any means.
No. So did all those countries remain part of the Warsaw Pact through to its dissolution? No.
I will just sort of say that there was terms in there for, if anybody else wanted to join, there were clauses in the treaty about how that would go about.
Yeah.
But Albania left. In 1962, after the Sino-Soviet split, they sided with China and they were still in the Warsaw Pact, technically, but they didn't really get involved. They weren't involved in exercise and things like that. And then in 1968, they formally withdrew as a protest against the invasion of Czechoslovakia.
Oh, okay. Okay, and what about Romania? Because I'm sure I read somewhere that they weren't as active a participant as perhaps some of the others.
Yeah, theoretically they were a full member. I don't think they were very trusted, and there was always a bit of distance, I think, between them and the rest of the... I saw an article just recently, actually. I think it was probably linked from the Facebook group, but it was entitled something like A Cold War Within a Cold War, and it was about Romania and their relationship with the rest of the Warsaw Pact. It was really quite interesting reading. Yeah,
I posted that on Twitter the other day. I'm glad you're reading the Twitter feed there. at Cold War Pod, if you're not already following everyone.
But yeah, it's also interesting to note that Romania was the only Warsaw Pact nation that made their own design of main battle tanks.
Okay, I didn't know that.
So, like, Czechoslovakia and Poland made T-55s and T-72s and had their own models with slight differences from the Soviet standard. Mm-hmm. But Romania had a couple of main battle tanks that were largely based on. I think it might even have been the Type 59, a Chinese one. I can't quite remember now whether it was T-55 or Type 59, but it was, whereas the Czech T-55 and the Polish one was like T-55 and then a series of numbers or letters after to designate the particular differences.
Yeah.
The Romanian one had their own designation, and they were designed in Romania.
And that was the only one. So generally, most of the Warsaw Pact was using Soviet designed, and were they made under license in the host country, or were they all made in the Soviet Union? Yeah, the main battle tanks were Soviet designs. The Czechs and the Poles made them in Czechoslovakia and Poland. Mm-hmm. There were other airfields. Various countries made their own things. The Czechs and the Poles had a rather successful couple of armoured personnel carriers that were completely homegrown, and there were things like self-propelled guns and stuff like that Warsaw Pact countries would make their own. Most of it was Soviet, though. Right. Okay. I think it's probably worth us just covering what the because we talk about AFV and we mean armored fighting vehicle, and there were various different types. Could you just explain what those different types are and what their function was?
Yeah, of course. This is something where you get, if you're not careful, you just drown in acronyms.
Yeah.
So APC is Armoured Personnel Carrier. Basically, exactly what it says. It's an armoured box that carries people. Some were tracked, some were wheeled. If they're wheeled, they would have all-wheel drive to give them a good, and quite often they would have like 8 driven wheels to give them a good cross-country mobility. Mm-hmm. But their job was just to get their troops to the front line. And they might be armed with a machine gun or something like that, but they wouldn't have much armament. There wouldn't be a lot of armour. And the troops would usually fight dismounted. So they'd ride the vehicle to the front and then they'd get out to actually fight and the vehicle would just hang back.
Okay. And there was another type which was the infantry fighting vehicles.
Yes.
So what was the difference between that and the armoured personnel carrier?
Well, the infantry fighting vehicle, or IFV, it tended to be better armoured. So the armour was thicker and it would be better armed. And that was much more designed to fight with the tanks. So the BMP was the main one in the Warsaw Pact. Mm-hmm. The initial model had a 73mm gun, but it was designed to carry a squad of infantrymen, so about 8 men. But rather than just dropping them off and then letting them go, it would stay with them and provide them with support. The defining characteristics of an IFV as opposed to a personnel carrier are that it will be quite well armed. Most designs have an autocannon, 20, 30mm, that sort of size. And most of them have an anti-tank missile as well.
Okay, and the one that probably most people will be familiar with is the main battle tank.
Yes.
Which is basically I was going to say regular tank, but it's quite a heavyweight tank, isn't it, in general?
Yes, although the Soviet designs tended to be lighter and smaller than the NATO designs. In the post-war years, most countries came around to the idea of having a sort of a universal tank, which became known as the main battle tank.
Right.
And some countries still had light tanks for reconnaissance and things like that, but the fighting tank would be the main battle tank, which, as you say, it was pretty hefty. It would have a big gun. It would have thick armour, and it would be capable of taking on anything on the battlefield. Okay,
and the other types are like an armoured car, which is pretty similar to a World War II design, is it?
Usually, yeah. The main ones in the Warsaw Pact were the BRDM-1 and BRDM-2, which were the two had a very small little turret. But the thing with an armoured car is that it's not really there to fight anything. It's there for reconnaissance and things. So it was mostly, it was like find out where the enemy is rather than actually shoot at them, really.
Right. Okay. And was there any other categories of AFV apart from those 4?
Yes. Self-propelled guns were quite a big one. In the West, most of the artillery would be self-propelled. So basically it's an artillery piece on some sort of vehicle to let it so that it can move around quickly.
Yeah.
The Soviets and the Warsaw Pact used quite a bit of towed artillery as well as self-propelled guns. And the Soviets really liked their multiple rocket launchers, which were known as Katyushas during World War II and still kept that nickname.
Yeah. Or the Stalin's organ, weren't they known as well?
Yeah, and Guards mortars, I think, was another term.
Right.
During World War II. I guess the best generic term would be tank destroyers, was the other main sort of fighting armoured fighting vehicles.
Okay, so there were self-propelled guns with artillery designed for bombardment, and then there were self-propelled guns that were purely designed as tank killers.
See, after World War II, because you get the anti-tank missiles starting to become prominent, quite a lot of the tank killers had missile armament rather than gun armament.
Right. And the main battle tank...
I always think of it as an evolution of the medium tank of World War II.
Mm-hmm.
But they are... modern ones are really quite heavy, and even by like the 1950s, it seemed to come from the medium tank lines. They were getting really quite heavy, and even a 1955, something like a T-55 would be looking at, you compare that to World War II tanks, and it's more like something like a Tiger or a King Tiger, which would have been heavy during World War II.
Surely that sort of level of design would cause problems trying to cross bridges or not.
And the Warsaw Pact actually had quite a thing about being able to cross rivers without bridges. The Soviet army did a study of West Germany and basically worked out that if they were to invade West Germany, and I think they were hoping to advance in like 100 kilometres a day, and they would cross several rivers every day if they were maintaining that sort of level of advance.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, NATO are going to blow up as many bridges as they can. So there was a lot of emphasis with Warsaw Pact vehicles in ways of crossing rivers.
Mm-hmm.
So the lighter vehicles, the armoured personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, things like that, were frequently amphibious and could swim. And the main battle tanks, which were just way too big for that sort of thing, I don't think the initial design of T-55 had this, but certainly the later ones all carried snorkels, which are just basically big, long tubes that would fit on top of the turret, and they would seal everything off, seal the barrels, and then it could just literally drive across the bottom of the river.
Wow, I wouldn't fancy doing that. I don't know about you, but I'd be worrying that my seals weren't quite right. Gosh, that must have been a bit nerve-wracking.
According to a British Army intelligence, kind of like a magazine actually, that I've got, they had dedicated places for training the crews to do this. But apparently these bases the men were really well looked after while they were there, and they wouldn't let them join their unit and carry on with their normal training until they were competent at doing this.
Right.
And they could wade up to something like 5 meters of depth of water. Although there were other considerations, like the strength of the current had to be below a certain amount, because otherwise the snorkel would just get snapped off. And if it was during the winter and there were bits of ice flowing down, then that could cause problems.
And also, I would have thought the bed of the river, I mean, as to how much traction you can get there. And, I mean, it just doesn't bear thinking about getting bogged down at the bottom of a river in a very heavy tank in winter.
There again, they were trained on how to escape, if that did happen.
Right.
There were, as I recall, the basic procedure was that you allow the water to get into the tank slowly, just open up something fairly small and then get out. But they were trained for that sort of thing.
Yeah. So to equalise the pressure and then get out, a bit like submarine training.
Yeah.
Oof. How about the guns? I mean, they were carrying quite heavy guns. What is it, 115 millimeter?
The modern
the main battle tanks.
The T-62 had 115 millimeter. Yeah. The T-64, which came along a little later, initially did, but then they upgunned that to 125, and that was the standard for the Warsaw Pact by the end of the Cold War. But they were, traditionally, of course, they were all rifled. That imparted the spin, and that's what meant that your shell was stable in flight.
Yeah, so there were grooves right the way down the barrel that basically spun the shell around as it passed through.
Exactly.
Okay.
With the T-62 was the first tank with this, but the Soviets had an anti-tank gun before the T-62. But these had smoothbore barrels, so they were just completely smooth on the inside, no rifling at all. The shell had a fin at the back that stabilised it, and it looked, and they tend to get referred to as a dart, and they're very, very long and very, very thin. And at the back, there's just and it's referred to as a fin, but when I think of a fin, I think of, like, you know, the sort of things that you get on darts and arrows and things like that. But these are more sort of at the back. It sort of expands, like,
so it sort of fans out. The shell, or the shape of the shell fans out. So it's almost like a funnel on the end of the shell, or a funnel shape.
Yes.
Okay, and I presume that prolonged the life of the barrel as well, not having rifling, or not?
It was cheaper to make, which was certainly for the Warsaw Pact nations with their huge armies was always a concern. And it was, the barrel would last longer because it was, you know, it had less stress on it and things. But the ammunition was more expensive.
Right. Oh, okay.
But it was also more effective because it relies on kinetic energy. If it's long and thin, you've got all the energy is coming at in a very small point at the end, whereas a traditional shell would be quite relatively fat. Yeah. And so, with the same amount of weight, you can have more energy, and therefore it will penetrate more armour.
So, I mean, none of these tanks were... Obviously, the Cold War didn't get hot in West Germany, but some of these tanks were presumably used in the Arab-Israeli wars. Presumably, NATO would get access to some of these and would learn from these, and presumably the Warsaw Pact would be learning from what worked and what didn't work.
The Israelis gave the Americans access to some stuff that they captured, and certainly the Arabs gave the Soviets access to some things. I mentioned earlier that the T-64 started off with a 115mm gun. Yeah. And it got up gun to 125 millimeters very early on in its life. It wasn't, strictly speaking, it wasn't due to a war, but an Iranian defector defected with his US-made M60 main battle tank. Right. Which gave the first time the Soviets had a look at it. Yeah. And that's why they increased the size of the gun, because they realised the 115mm just wasn't going to be good enough. And I'm fairly sure that the M60 was similarly had some changes made after the Americans got hold of some captured Soviet equipment from the Israelis. Right. Okay. But one thing that did... I think it was the 1967 war where anti-tank missiles really came into their own, because it was the first time they'd really been used. And there were reports of Israelis seeing Egyptians carrying what looked like suitcases, and they were man-portable anti-tank missiles. And the thing that you carried them in looked like a suitcase. Yeah. And because it was the first time they were really used in any sort of numbers, they were completely new. People didn't know how to counter them, and the Israelis suffered initially quite heavily from them. But then I've seen some newspaper headlines and things saying that, like, this was the death knell of the tank, and they're obsolete now, which obviously hasn't turned out to be true. But by the 1973 war, the countermeasures had been worked out and things, and the Israelis had actually spent some time thinking about this. And as with things like this, the one side makes an advance in something, and then the other side finds a way around it. It's that constant sort of, one thing improves and the other thing improves to beat it again. So the downside of anti-tank missiles is that they're quite slow, and especially the early ones, because the operator had to literally steer it onto its target with a little joystick.
Right.
So it couldn't go too fast because otherwise, the operator wouldn't be able to guide it.
Yeah.
And it would take something like about 30 seconds to travel at maximum range, which gives if the crew of the tank that's being fired at are alert and sufficiently on the ball, then they can react to it, and they might fire smoke discharges to hide the tank.
Mm-hmm.
They could fire back at the person who's aiming it if they can work out where it's come from, and not necessarily hit them. If you can just make them flinch.
Yeah, put them off.
Yeah. All of a sudden they tilt the joystick the wrong way and the missile goes flying off in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
That's all you need, it's...
Okay, and these were wire-guided, these missiles, weren't they?
Yeah. That particular one was called the Saga, or rather NATO called it the Saga. I always think of it as that. The Russian name is Malyutka, I think, although I've no idea if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Sounded impressive to me, Russell, so... Sounded good to me. And... Okay, so how did the Warsaw Pact AFVs compare to the NATO equivalents?
They were cheaper. They were, I guess partly because they needed to make a lot of them. They tended to be a lot simpler and cheaper. And they didn't care quite so much as NATO did about creature comforts. So they were. They tend to be cramped and not necessarily easy to use. Although I did read fairly recently that the BMP was the first of that sort of size vehicle to have a T-bar for steering instead of a pair of sticks, whereas the American M113 and the British FV42 had a pair, I can't remember what they're called now, but a pair of sticks that you sort of pull and push on.
Right.
The BMP had a bar, which is closer to a car steering wheel, and so it's easier to use. The main battle tanks tended to be smaller, and depending on who you talk to, that can make a difference in how easy they are to hit. But I think that really depends on exactly how good your opponent is.
Yeah. And I presume spares-wise, because they're all made of a similar design, spares and parts would have been, the maintenance would have been easier because there's some commonality there.
Yeah, and even within series like the BTR series, there was the BTR-60, the BTR-70, and the BTR-80. There were three distinct vehicles, but there was a fair degree of commonality between the three of them.
Did the Warsaw Pact have different tactics to NATO in how they intended to attack, or their general deployment? Yeah, I mean they were more focused on the attack and on numbers and mass. The 1980s, when I was wargaming this, I remember looking at it and sort of thinking, because some of the people I knew at the time were absolutely convinced that because NATO had better equipment on the whole, and at least some of their armies were volunteers rather than conscripts, if it did come to a shooting war, then NATO would win hands down. And I was never entirely convinced, because it always seemed to me that if you look at the later years of World War II, the Germans had some really good stuff. Like the Panther was a very good tank, although it had some mechanical issues. Whereas the Allies had things like the Sherman, and it seemed to me like the Germans then had the quality, but not the numbers, and they lost. Yeah.
And I couldn't help thinking, is that going to repeat itself? And nowadays I'm really not sure. I think it would. I wouldn't honestly like to call it.
Okay.
I'm just really glad it never happened. Really.
Yeah. No, aren't we all? To be honest,
I mean, even if it never came to if they both sides managed to keep off the nukes, it would still have been a horrible.
Oh, it would. Yeah, it
costly.
devastated the heart of Europe, and it doesn't bear thinking about. What about the officers commanding these tanks? I mean, how were they trained? And
well, that's an interesting point. Actually, the Soviet system and the Warsaw Pact armies tended to model the Soviet system, relied on officers to a greater extent than NATO did, or rather, they didn't rely on NCOs as much as NATO did. Is probably the fair way to say it. Whereas NATO would, and it's something of a stereotype, but you get the sergeant who's been in the army for like years and years, and knows everything backwards, and then the young fresh-faced lieutenant comes along and basically learns from the sergeant.
Yeah.
In the Soviet system, they didn't. The NCOs weren't like that. Sergeants were conscripts along with all the privates. They were just the one. They'd pick out the more promising ones and make them sergeants, but they'd serve the 2 years and then go home in most cases. A few of them stayed on, but not many. So it was, the officers had a lot more to do, and they were given a lot, or expected to use initiative a lot less. Everything was kind of higher up the chain. When your low-level officers are given their orders, that it's much more, this is what you are going to do and this is how you are going to do it. Whereas NATO would be more sort of, you need to do this, and the officer would then go off and work out how to do it.
The Warsaw Pact is, as you read, their initial treaty is a treaty of friendship and fraternal brotherhood of the socialist nations. Was there much rivalry between the different armies, particularly, I would imagine on exercise? I know that certainly with NATO, there'd be a lot of national rivalry to be the best.
Yeah, in particular, I can't remember where I read it now, but I remember reading a translated report of an exercise. So, this was a report that a Soviet officer had written, and I think I found it on the CIA's reading room. But it noted that it was talking about the East German and the Polish officers, and they really, really did not get on. As I recall, it was the Poles didn't like the East Germans because they thought the East Germans looked down on them, and the East Germans didn't like the Poles because they did look down on them. They basically thought that they were rubbish. And I think this was the exercise had taken place in like the 60s or so. And I couldn't help wondering how much of that was a sort of throwback to the World War II sort of attitude. Because, the Nazis in Germany really indoctrinated everybody to consider everybody to the East as being lesser, not really human and so on. I wondered how much of that was still in the German sort of subconscious.
Yeah. I mean, I've always been amazed that the East German army retained the goose step as their sort of marching style, with all the Prussian and Nazi connotations around it. It always surprises me, and I've never sort of been able to determine why they did that. But I think, obviously, if you're talking about a report in the 1960s, that is, potentially only 15, 20 years since the end of World War II. And obviously there were German territories that were given to Poland and all of that. There's a lot of, political and nationalistic complications in there as well.
You can't stop people from having those feelings and feeling like that about each other. Yeah,
no, absolutely. I mean, you can look at Yugoslavia with the death of Tito and the whole, implosion of that country and the nationalism rising there, but also in the former, all the former Soviet republics. I mean, it's difficult to sort of describe this in a way that doesn't sound strange, but it did seem like a simpler world when the Cold War was on, because it was basically the Warsaw Pact versus NATO, and it was quite straightforward. Whereas the the world now has become far more complicated.
Yeah, this may be something of a tangent, but
we like tangents here, Russell. So go for it.
I see something that people don't necessarily think about is that the Soviet Union, of course, wasn't just we have a tendency to refer to it as Russia sometimes, but it wasn't just Russia. There was all these other states making up the Soviet Union. So even within the Soviet army, you had a massive languages, and that caused real problems for communication within units, because the Soviets didn't make a Kyrgyz unit and a Georgian unit. They just mashed them all together. Oh. And a lot of the privates, come from Kyrgyzstan or wherever, wouldn't speak Russian. And Russian was the language of the army. And they'd learn a few words of Russian so they could do at least the basics that the officers told them to do, or at least know what they were being told to do. But there was communication was always a problem. 2 years later, he's not there anymore.
That's really, I'd not thought of that, because you just imagine a homogenous Russian-speaking army, but yeah, you don't necessarily recognize that the Soviet or the Red Army was made up of all these different nationalities.
Well, that's the thing.
Some of them won't be fluent in Russian.
Yeah, and the Warsaw Pact had that, and NATO had that to some extent, because each of them are alliances of various countries that have their own languages.
Yeah,
but at least within the East German army, everybody speaks German.
Yeah, yeah, and with NATO, you had British units. You didn't have a unit made of Dutch, British, and French.
Exactly, and that's exactly the kind of thing that you had in the Soviet army.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. I'd never thought of it that way. How protected were the Warsaw Pact vehicles for nuclear and chemical weapons? Were they? I presume that was all part of their standard equipment, and
it did tend to be. Yeah, I mean, part of going back to the BMP that I was talking about earlier, the infantry fighting vehicle. Part of one of the sort of concepts of how you would fight with that, it was designed right from the outset to be able to operate in a chemical environment and so on. So it was all sealed off, and and I don't know if you've ever noticed on main tank guns, you tend to have a bulge partway down the barrel. On
the barrel. Yeah, you're going to tell me what that does now.
Yeah. It's the fume extractor, and it kind of serves two purposes really, because it stops the fumes from firing the gun from getting back into the tank, so it keeps them outside. So your crew are better off. But it also means that chemicals and things from outside are less likely to enter through the barrel.
Right.
So it certainly from I think the T-54 and the very early models of T-55 weren't fully protected against radiation and chemicals, but certainly later models were, and from that point on, pretty much virtually everything was. Early armoured personnel carriers like the original BTR-60 and the BTR-50 were open-topped, so the troops would only be protected if they were actually wearing their NBC suits.
Yeah.
But that's one of the reasons why things like that started becoming covered, so they could
have greater protection.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks for that. I did have some additional questions which aren't necessarily directly related to Warsaw Pact AFVs, but have you collected anything down the years of your interest in the Cold War?
I'm not really a collector in the sense of some of the people you've interviewed have heard, but I used to own an Ushanka, the Russian fair hat.
Oh yeah, with the red star in the middle of it. Yeah.
Well, mine was East German, so it had the East German.
The hammer and compasses.
Yes, that's the one. But I like hats anyway, and that one was incredibly warm. I never actually worked with the ear flaps down because I never needed to.
It's so temperate in the UK, yeah.
Even I only ever wore it in the winter because any other time it would be too warm. But even in the winter, it was an incredibly warm warm thing. I loved that hat.
Yeah.
But I lost it probably in a house move somewhere. I have still got an East German combat jacket. I bought one not long after the war fell. Where I lived at the time in South Yorkshire, there was a market stall that suddenly had loads of East German ex-military stuff.
Yeah.
And it was all really, really cheap. And it was great. I don't know if you're familiar with it's known as the raindrop camouflage pattern. And it's the camouflage pattern is sort of like lines, probably about an inch or two long, all over the jacket.
Yeah.
It's a really odd looking kind of camouflage, to be honest, but I think the Poles used it as well, or a variation of it. I also have, I think I mentioned this earlier, but it's called Army Technical Intelligence Review, and it's, the best I can tell, it's in the format of like a magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to be something that the British intelligence, military intelligence created probably, I think from the dates, I think there's a couple or three per year. And it would just have all sorts of information about foreign military equipment and things. And I've got quite a few copies of those from the 60s and the 70s, which I bought from Bovington Tank Museum a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I was there for the weekend. They have this event called Tank Fest, where a lot of their exhibits are still running. They can actually drive them around and things.
Yeah.
And Tank Fest, they get them out for the weekend and drive them around the arena. And for somebody like me, it's fantastic.
Yeah. So it's like the Glastonbury of armoured fighting vehicles.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Right. Okay. Got it.
But they have a library and an archive service, and they had a stall, and they had a crate with these things in. I was looking through them, and I was thinking, these look really interesting. And I didn't have a lot of spare money to spend on them, so I'm like, picking out the most interesting looking ones.
Mm.
And I said to the one behind the store, like, how much are these? And she said to me, ridiculous, like 10 pence each or something.
Yeah.
I was like, I'll have them all. I came away with this big bundle of them. It's not necessarily great from a point of view of having a good reference of what these things are, because quite often it's inaccurate.
Yeah.
But it can be fascinating to see what NATO's ideas were.
Yeah, what their perspective was at the time and what they believed at the time.
Yeah.
Wow. So you've mentioned Bovington, but are there any other places you'd recommend for people to see these vehicles in the flesh?
Well, if you're interested in this kind of thing, Bovington is always worth a visit. They don't have a lot of Warsaw Pact stuff, but they've got a couple of T-72s, one of which I think they swapped for a Chieftain. A few years ago now, they basically gave a Chieftain tank to a Polish museum, and the Polish museum gave Bovington a T-72 in exchange.
Right.
I just love the idea that these museums are like swapping tanks,
Yeah. The last time I went to Bovington, I was aged 11, believe it or not. So I think it's probably changed quite a bit. It's one of these ones I've always wanted to go to, but living up north, it's not that convenient. So where else in the UK would you say?
I'm afraid it's down south again, but the Imperial War Museum, Duxford, its focuses mainly on aeroplanes, but they do have quite a collection of ground vehicles as well, and they have some really quite interesting Warsaw Pact kit.
Okay, because I've been to Cosford, where they've got the Cold War Museum there. I mean, it's mainly aircraft, but they have got a couple of vehicles. I think they've got a Leopard and a Bricksmiths vehicle there as well.
Oh, right, cool. It's on my list of places that I want to go, I must admit. And so, yeah, if you have the money, or if you happen to live over there, there's a museum at Kubinka in Russia. I think it's about an hour out of Moscow.
I've seen photos of it, and it looks amazing. But a lot of the stuff's outdoors as well, which I was quite surprised at.
It's also worth knowing that there are small sort of private collections in the UK. So, like, it's worth trying to, whenever you go on holiday, it's worth trying to find out if there's a small private collection near where you're going.
Yes, I did that a couple of years back. I went to the Norfolk Tank Museum, which has a great Cold War collection. They've got Chieftain, Centurion, Scorpion, Scimitar as well. And I was so lucky. I went there on a quiet day, and the guys showed me around and took me inside the Chieftain. So I was able to sit inside the turret and get a real feel for it. It was incredible. So I'd recommend that one. It's a great little museum, but as you say, there's quite a few of them dotted around the country.
I once managed to get inside a Scud. I was at the Finningley Air Show near Doncaster. A private collector, I think it was Budge. The guy who owns a construction company and collects military vehicles as a hobby. And he'd brought some of his vehicles along. And one of them was a Scud missile launcher.
Yeah.
With the missile on top. And I was like taking photographs of it and thinking, I must have been a teenager because I don't think I'd have the cheek anymore. But I asked if I could get inside it. And the guy just sort of like gave me a bit of a look and I went, "Yeah, all right."
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, you see, if you don't ask, you don't get. So
that's what they say.
There you go. There you go. So what's the most surprising thing you've discovered in your research into Warsaw Pact AFVs?
I think there are two things that I've been particularly surprised at. And one of them, I found out looking into a British vehicle rather than a Warsaw Pact one, that's fuel as armour. The British had this concept which never made it into production. It was called Contentious. And it was quite a small vehicle, but it was designed to have the same sort of armour and firepower as a medium tank, because this was like 50s rather than later. And it looked somewhat like the Swedish S-tank. You know, the one with the...
Yeah, without the turret.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was going to be quite squat, and it was, the gun was fixed in place and all this kind of thing. But it had some really interesting ideas. And one of them was that the fuel tank was going to be right at the front of the vehicle. Which
seems completely illogical, yeah. Keep going.
But they did various tests to, make sure that it wasn't just going to be a death trap. And what they found was actually provided a certain amount of armour. It wasn't as good as actual armour plates, but it was something like, it was going to be a big fuel tank, so it was going to be pretty thick.
Yeah.
But it's something like every 3 inches of fuel was equivalent to 1 inch of armour plate, as long as the fuel tank was full, of course.
Yeah.
And the other thing they found was that it was really difficult to actually set the fuel on fire. And if it was diesel, it was virtually impossible.
Yeah.
And the other thing they said was, well, you know what? Even if they also looked at the potential for explosions, and they decided depending on the kind of fuel used, there was potential for explosions if there was just the right amount of fuel and just the right amount of gap and things. Mm-hmm. But that only needed something like 3/4 of an inch, I think it was, of mild steel to contain the explosion. So, of course, this was going to be surrounded by armour plate, so that wasn't an issue. There were some situations where, depending on the kind of fuel used and so on, you might have an external fire and the fuel falling out would fuel the fire. But given that it's a tank and it can move, they figured that it could just move out of the way.
Yeah. That's interesting, because I remember seeing a photo, or I might have read about it, about a Soviet armoured personnel carrier, I think it was, and the doors were fuel tanks.
That would be the BMP, yes.
And I thought, well, that seems a bit balmy, but now I can see there was some reason behind the madness.
Well, I've seen plenty of people saying that that's just a terrible idea, but I'm not convinced anymore. And like I said, most of the tests that the British did, they found it was really hard to actually get this to light at all, especially with diesel, which is what the BMP used. It was virtually impossible.
Yeah.
But the other really quite surprising thing was that most Soviet-designed AFVs have a capability where, and I'm told that NATO vehicles can do this as well, but it never seems to be written down. But they can inject diesel into the exhaust manifold. But when they do that, it creates smoke. The thing is, at Tankfest a couple of years ago, they had a T-72 running round, and he obviously switched that on because all of a sudden this massive smoke billowed out from behind it.
Yeah.
Like half a circuit of the track, and then he turned it back off again. It all dissipated.
Well, you'd want something like that if somebody's firing their wire-guided heat missile at you with 30 seconds of...
Well, the thing is, you actually want your mate in front of you to do it. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or turn it on and then turn around quickly. I don't know. So now it's time for the quick fire round. And the first question is, if you were a filmmaker, what real-life Cold War incident would you recreate on film?
There's a couple of real-life ones. I'm not...
Actually, it doesn't have to be real life. I mean, it's like what Cold War scenario would... I'm going to change... I'll change this. What Cold War scenario would you want to recreate?
To be honest, the one that I would really like to see is a film of the Cold War turned hot. The old. When I was a kid, I grew up watching all these World War II films of big battles and things. And I'd really like to see that in the Cold War.
Yeah,
I'm
surprised nobody's done that, because there's a number of novels out there sort of describing that, aren't there? There
are. A lot of them tend to be really big, sort of all-encompassing. I suspect if you tried to turn something like Red Storm Rising into a film, you would end up with like 6 3-hour films.
Yeah, it'd be like Lord of the Rings, wouldn't it?
Yeah, people would still complain you'd missed half of it out.
Yeah.
In real life, I'm not sure if it would work as well as a film. It might work better as a book, but something about Stanislav Petrov. The guy, it was in the 80s, I think, and he was the guy who was watching out for a nuclear launch from the West, and the systems alerted him that the Americans had launched some missiles. And instead of picking up the phone to alert his superiors, he picked up the phone and reported a technical error. Partly, to be honest, I'd like to see that turn into something like a film, just to make people more aware of it, because if you're not interested in the period and things, then most people just never heard of him. And I think that's a real shame.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's a bit like there's a new book out called 1983. It's written by an author called, I think it's Taylor Downing, and it's all about the whole Able Archer scare.
Yes. I was listening to a podcast about that just yesterday, I think.
Yeah. No, it's a fascinating story. And again, it's sort of one of these ones that a lot of people sort of go with the Cuban Missile Crisis as being, the most dangerous period. But the more you hear about that Able Archer scare, it was even closer with that.
People don't know about it for the most part. That's... I think the thing just occurred to me, I was listening to the podcast about it. The thing is, the first anyone would have known about it would have been the sirens going off.
Yeah.
That's the really scary bit, I think. I didn't live through it, but with the Cuban Missile Crisis, everybody knew that it was going on. Everybody knew there was a chance. But with Able Archer, it would have just been, all of a sudden the sirens are going off and you're like, what the...
Yeah, what the hell's going on?
Yeah.
No, I mean, it is a terrifying thought. Is there any other films you want to make?
Yes, there is. I take it you've seen The Hunt for Red October.
I have. Good film.
It is, and it's a good book as well, although he really should have had the sauna. Did you know that the Typhoon missile boats had a sauna and the gym and the swimming pool?
No, I honestly didn't know that. Wow, it sounds like the Hilton undersea.
The tiny ones, they're all really small, but they had. And the thing that every time I see Hunt for Red October now, and there's the officers after they've killed the political officer, they're talking about the plans thing. I keep thinking this should be in the sauna,
Yeah.
Because listening devices, that much steam, just like that would happen in the sauna, surely.
Yeah.
But of course, nobody in the West had any clue that they had stuff like that. I've seen a YouTube video showing you these these things in a typhoon. And it's just amazing.
You've got to find me the link for that. I definitely want to post that on the show notes for this one.
I'll find it out. Like I said, the swimming pool especially is absolutely tiny.
Yeah.
But the fact that they thought that they put a swimming pool in a submarine is just it's mind blowing.
Well, particularly when you talked about the lack of comfort in their armoured fighting vehicles.
That's true. Yeah.
You'd think that would be one of the last things they would put in a submarine.
But yeah, the reason I mentioned the Red October, I would like to see a film of the incident that inspired Clancy to write that.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, it was a guy called Valery Sablin, who was the political officer on a ship called the Storezivoy. And the West assumed that he was trying to defect.
Right.
But actually, he was trying to start a new revolution. I think he was stationed in Riga, and he was trying to get to Leningrad. I think I might have got that wrong, but basically, he was he was unhappy with the corruption and things in the Soviet system, and wanted to spark a new revolution. I wasn't
aware. I think I'm vaguely aware that obviously Red October was based on something, but I hadn't realised that it was somebody trying to overthrow the Soviet Union.
I don't think Clancy realised that when he wrote it, to be honest, because I think this is a fairly new thing that's fairly recently come out.
Yeah.
Because even at the time, all the West went, oh, obviously he was trying to defect. Obviously.
Yeah.
And apparently the communist leadership were like, yes, that's a better explanation. We'll go with that. Yes, he was trying to defect.
Wow. Okay, so what would be your soundtrack for your Cold War film?
It didn't really do it to me at the time, but now I heard Two Tribes fairly recently by Frankie Goes to Hollywood.
Yep.
And the voiceover at the start and the siren really made the hairs on my
back. Yeah, Patrick, can't remember his surname, but he was the official voice of the adverts they would have put on to tell you how to take cover.
A series of films, I think, that he voiced. And it was just, especially because it was his voice, overlaid on the thing. It just, really made me.
Yeah. Have you seen the video of that?
Not for a very...
it's basically two lookalikes of Reagan and Chernenko, I think it was at the time, fighting in a wrestling ring. It's worth finding out. I'll put a link to that on the show notes as well. It's going to be an eclectic range of videos on the show notes for this one, without a doubt. Okay, so you've got three personalities from the Cold War you can invite down the pub. Who would they be?
It would have to be Mrs. Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and Mikhail Gorbachev. Because when they were the personalities when I was, let me think, I think I was about 9 when Thatcher came to power. I think Reagan came to power about the same time. And I think Gorbachev, I was probably about 15, something like that. So when I was actually aware of sort of world politics, they were the big three. So have to be those three. Okay,
and any particular questions you'd like to ask them?
Oh, yeah. But I have to say,
bear in mind, we've I've got a limited amount of disk space here. So
I do have to say that I'd be a bit skeptical about some of the answers. If there was some way I could force them to tell the truth, that would be absolutely fantastic.
Okay, let's assume we've given them all a truth serum in their pint of best.
See, I always thought that the Soviets never really intended to invade Western Europe, and I think they were always as scared of the West as we were of them. Yeah. And I'd really like to ask Gorbachev about that and find out if I'm actually right. Or, if actually, there were masses of plans and they just never did it for some reason.
Yeah. I'll have to get him on the show and ask him. You've got to aim high in this game, Russell.
Oh, absolutely. See, if you don't ask, you don't get.
There you go. Okay, so Margaret Thatcher. What would you want to ask her?
I'd like to know what she wrote in her letters of last resort for the nuclear submarines.
Yeah, so these are the letters that every serving British Prime Minister writes and gives to the captains of the nuclear submarines to open in the event of the order coming to fire.
Yeah. I think, actually, my understanding is that they're only opened if all other forms of communication are lost.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no,
So,
I think you're right.
sort of,
I think you're right, actually.
You know, Britain's been flattened sort of scenario.
Yeah.
You know, and it's either a get the buggers, you know, or, well, you know, we've lost now, go to Australia, have a good life, you know.
Yeah.
But I remember I heard an interview with Neil Kinnock some years ago, and he was saying that the only person he'd ever met, who he wasn't certain might push the button, because he was absolutely convinced that nobody would ever actually order a nuclear strike. And the only person he thought might have was Thatcher.
Right.
That's the only person he'd met who he thought she might have done it. Everybody else he'd met, he thought they wouldn't. So I'd really like to know what was in her letters.
Okay, that's good. I'm liking these. Okay, what about Ronald Reagan then?
Right, well, my question's for him more about the Falklands War.
Okay, that's still effectively Cold War period, so you're okay there.
There was a bit of when Argentina invaded the Falklands, the Americans were in quite an awkward position, to be fair to them, because at the time Argentina and Britain were both their allies. And so, you know, there was a certain amount of, like, both sides saying, so you're going to help us, right? You know, and they eventually helped us more and basically ignored the Argentinians. But I know there was quite a bit of, within the American government, there were people on both sides. So, a couple of questions. The Argentinians had a plan to sink a British warship in Gibraltar.
Okay. Now, how were they going to do that? My geography suggests that would be quite difficult.
Well, they got a team to Spain, who then were launching it from Spain. So it wasn't even a special forces operation. It was basically a bunch of civilians that they hired to do this.
Okay.
But the plan was that they were in Spain, and they would, I think they were planning on using a little motorboat or something. Like, they were going to, of course, you know, if you're in the right sort of Spain, the harbour in Gibraltar is like just over the water.
Yeah.
But the thing is, that's within NATO's area of operations.
Yeah.
Had it happened, the UK could have invoked Article 5, which would have required the rest of NATO to fight Argentina.
Right. Okay.
So, what I'd really like to know is, what would the Americans have done if that had happened? I mean, it's quite a bit of lead up there, but because the only time Article 5 was ever invoked was after the 9/11 attacks.
Yeah. It's an interesting quandary there, because, I mean, what you're describing is effectively an attack from an existing NATO country on a fellow NATO country by nationals that are not from the territory that the attack has been launched from.
Yes.
And I would have thought, you know, I would imagine in that situation, the US are not going to side with Argentina. They're also not going to probably use military action, but they are going to really put the screws on Argentina to capitulate, which in some ways they did during the Falklands anyway, didn't they? Because they were I think they were giving the British a lot of satellite coverage.
Yeah, and the Soviets were doing the same sort of thing for Argentina.
Yeah. Okay. So are there any books that you would recommend for anyone interested in learning more about Warsaw Pact armoured fighting vehicles, or the Warsaw Pact military in general, for that matter?
One in particular is called Weapons and Tactics of the Soviet Army. It's by David Isby, and I think it was published by James.
Yeah.
But it's not one of the big Jane's annuals.
Yeah.
And I think it's largely based on some of the US field manuals. I think it's, at least parts of it are largely based on those.
Right.
But it's an excellent, it's a really good all-round sort of thing. If you don't want to have piles and piles of books about it because you're not that interested, it's a good, it's got specs on most of the equipment, and it's also got sections on tactics and operational doctrine and things like that. So it's a really good all-round sort of thing.
Film, TV series, what would you recommend that you think is, a good representation of life in the Warsaw Pact?
I think they're obvious choices, to be honest. And but Deutschland 83 I thought was absolutely brilliant. I'm sure it got mentioned in the Spybury episodes, and also Goodbye Lenin. I can't remember if anybody's mentioned that yet, but I think it's a great film. No, absolutely. Both of those I would go for. So you can't think of anything that involves tracks and 115 millimeter guns. Sadly, there's not that many films about that, which is why you want one made. There is a film called The Beast of War, or The Beast. It seems to have two titles depending on exactly where you see it.
Yeah.
It's the only film I've seen that is set during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan.
Right. Okay. So where's the best place for people to find you online?
If you go to rpbook.co.uk, and that will redirect you to my main site, but it's a lot easier to say.
Yes. Okay, and you're also on Twitter as well, aren't you?
Yes, at rpbook.
Okay. I'll put a link to both of those. And so you've written some books on Warsaw Pact armoured fighting vehicles, haven't you? There's a couple of them.
They're the start of a series, and the next one is artillery, which will include self-propelled artillery and things. So it does have some vehicles in it. But yeah, the hope is to eventually just cover certainly the most important weapons and equipment of the Warsaw Pact. Right.
Okay, well, I'll add links to your site on the show notes, and people can go and look and see your books. Russell, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
I've really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Good. No, well, thank you very much for coming on to the podcast, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed our chat with Russell. If you'd like to understand more about the subjects, the books and the films we discussed, there's links in the show notes at coldwarconversations.com/the-word-episode and the number 8. Don't forget, you can join our discussion group on Facebook. Just search Cold War Conversations. And we're also on Twitter at Cold War Pod. If you like what you're hearing, please leave reviews on iTunes or with your podcast provider. Thank you very much for listening.
This is the Voice of America, Washington, D.C., signing off.